Kodiak Founders, take one.
Brian and Eric, it's awesome to be with you guys today. Thank you for getting together. You know, it's hard to believe it's been over 10 years since we launched the whole idea of what ultimately became Kodiak with three of us and Kyle. And it's just awesome to get a chance to kind of relive some of the memories of those early days in particular. I guess I'd start out and just ask you guys, I mean, what do you remember about some of those earliest conversations we had literally before we formed this, but as we talked about it, what comes to mind?
I mean, obviously the first memory is really the hatching of the idea. It took place, I don't know how many people know this, but we came up with this at about 3 a.m. one night. We were all sitting at the ProBuild offices, exhausted from pulling another all-nighter, and Brian and I walked into Steve's office and we were like, we got to figure something else out. And you were like, right off the bat, you were like, you know what, I got an idea for this. And really we hatched the initial game plan from that point on. I remember getting in the car, driving home and calling my wife and waking her up at 3 a.m. and telling her, hey, this is great, we're gonna quit our jobs, we're going to raise some money, we're gonna go buy businesses. We won't make any money at first, but it'll be awesome. And it's, that was probably the hardest sell job of any of them.
Couldn't agree more. The selling the wives on it was tough. We got this great idea where you can't make money up front and it will all come later. That was really fun, and I can't agree more with Eric on that. Just the entire fact that the three of us at 3 a.m. were on the same page within 3 minutes, it was amazing.
Well, as you guys said, I mean, when we had that conversation, I'd been having some conversations with the Barton family, and that was the first night I told you guys about that. And but the other thing that reminds me of is that sure, Barton was in the building product space, but when we first started talking about this, and even in the context of doing the deal with the Barton family, our original plan was to really form an investment group that was not specifically focused on building products. This is our first opportunity. Hopefully it goes well and we can be successful with that, and maybe we do something else in a few years, but it was gonna be more of an investment group. What do you guys remember about just kind of the pivot of deciding to focus on building products, which is really what ultimately then became Kodiak, particularly in the context of, we were still in the Great Recession. It was late 2010, early 2011, and it wasn't really the most obvious time to start a building products distribution business.
Ultimately, it wasn't up to us. We had other investments that we were looking at, but what we could raise money for was building products because of our experience, which is kind of funny because we were the ones in the room who really believed that it was the bottom of the cycle. I mean, the four of us were a lot less concerned than everybody else about housing going forward. We'd spent the last, I don't know how many years studying it at ProBuild, so.
Yeah, I mean, even boiling back to ProBuild, when you pitched them that on a micro level, the building products business was turning around and they just wouldn't bite across that board, we knew it was our time. And just the timing and the luck of that kind of all came together. And of course, eventually adding Paul helps with that side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was Paul being kind of that fifth founder that joined the team a couple months later, once we had the Barton deal working and going, and we were working on raising capital, which we'll talk about a little later. I think Paul, not only Paul joining us, but when I think back to it, had Paul not retired from ProBuild, really that in some ways became a catalyst for us because he was such a great leader, a visionary leader. Really a lot of the model for how we've operated and built Kodiak was very much based off a lot of the way he had wanted to do ProBuild, right? And him leaving ProBuild and the culture changing there was part of that catalyst for us to want to leave and go out and create our own thing. And I just look back to one pivotal moment of us really getting this off the ground being when he joined us and said, hey, I want to back this and I want to be a part of helping you guys get this started and mentor this team and just be a part of this and what it can become. I thought was one of those pivotal moments that went from the idea and are we going to be able to do this to, hey, this is actually going to happen.
Yeah, I can remember sitting there with investors and with Paul in the room too, and us talking about this strategy across multiple industries, and investors telling us, that sounds great, but why don't we just do this just in building products? And we're like, okay, that sounds great.
Yeah.
If you're going to give us money, we'll do it.
You guys, when you talked about, just the idea of selling the idea that, hey, we're going to start something, we have no income for a while until we can get this going, but we think it'll ultimately turn into something. It reminds me, maybe one of you guys can talk a little bit about just the creative way we financed our startup as we worked on the Barton deal, raised capital, before we could get to even the starting line where we actually had a business that we could actually give ourselves some kind of salary. We did come up with some creative ways to kind of finance that.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I had just finished grad school and was owed ProBuild a couple years of my life from grad school. And so when they decided that they were going to go a different direction, I was the first one to throw my hand up, like, you got to let me go, because that's the only way I was getting out of owing those years. And I definitely didn't want to be the only one left there out of our group. But I mean, talk about good timing. But we tried to convince them to do this strategy first. And I mean, it worked out, once they kind of said that they were done investing in this, then it's an easy conversation to say, well, then you probably don't need us.
All right.
But it was fortuitous for sure.
It's funny you say the last one standing, because that's the position I didn't want to be in. And even though I screamed as loud as possible, I was the last one standing for a while, with no deviation from wanting to leave. But still, that was an interesting time, because you guys had already, at least at that point, you guys had already exited. You'd come back and did some consulting work. You were full-blown negotiating a deal, and at night we were just meeting consistently across the board.
It was concerning for a minute there that you did too good of a job at ProBuild and they weren't going to let you leave.
Yeah, they did try to hire me, but I was like, I'm too busy. I got other stuff going on.
No, I mean, it's funny to think back, and I think you and Kyle were the first ones that were laid off from there in December of 10.
Laid off and hired back
and
as
hired
a
back the
consultant.
next week to consult, which was great. I was laid off at the end of January and actually scheduled the final negotiation with the Bartons the day after I got laid off, and we signed the LOI that day. And then, like you said, you got left behind
all alone
for 5 months because we couldn't pool all of our severances together and cover all four of us. So you had to stick around until we could get the Barton deal done.
Yeah, a lot of fun though. At the time, it was so exciting. Just the possibilities were endless.
So, ultimately, we spent 6 months working on putting the deal together, and finally we got to the July 15th date, which was, I think, a little delayed from what we'd originally planned. But July 15th, 2011, we closed with the Barton family, and we're off to the races, creating Kodiak.
Yeah, and I mean, that was kind of just, even that delay was kind of a crazy time, because we backed up. We were ready to close in May, and we had a couple things happen. So we were all kind of walking around Barton, not sure how to help manage, but we were helping and still waiting for the actual close, and everybody assumed we were already all the owners. So there was that kind of whole month and a half, or a month and a few days, that we were just walking around, all still hoping.
So both of you guys mentioned a little bit earlier the challenge of going home and telling Di and Hannah about this great idea we have, and yet I also know the reality is that the two of them and Linda were incredibly supportive, crazily supportive of what we did, and I remember a couple of things in particular. One thing I remember in that early process, and it was probably sometime around March of 2011, we had the deal under LOI, we were trying to raise capital, we were doing due diligence, and you guys, I don't know if you guys remember this or not, I got a job offer with a big corporation back in the Midwest. And it was kind of that, I had to really decide if I was going to do this or not, because they needed an answer. We didn't know yet if we were going to make this happen. And it was like, do I pass up this solid, good corporate job and go for this? Or, I got a wife and 3 kids to support, and what do I do? And I sat down, I remember sitting down in our living room and talking with Linda about that, and I had to give the corporation an answer the next day. And I just remember talking to her about, maybe the prudent thing is to do that. We'd have to move, but it's a safe and it's a good, solid opportunity. And I just remember her looking at me and saying, "You've been wanting to do this for something like this for the last decade. You can't pass on this. And frankly, if it doesn't work out, then we're going to start over. And you can do that then. That'll always be there, but you can't pass up this opportunity." I'm sure you guys had some of those kind of conversations, but what do you remember about just some of the support and encouragement you got from Di and from Hannah in those early days?
I mean, honestly, I joke that was a hard sales pitch, but really, even at 3 a.m., Di was like, "All right, that sounds great. I'm sure you guys will do awesome at it." I mean, really, she never doubted us for a second. I mean, she was always supportive, and she was behind it 100%. She knew that it was something that we had all talked about for a long time. So, couldn't have done it without our wives, for sure. They were all huge assets.
Yeah, Hannah was the same boat. The no pay thing was a little interesting, but other than that, she was 100% supportive. She was even supportive on that, just because, she was like, "This is a dream. You don't get many shots at it. We need to take it. Let's not really worry about next year or even really next month. We'll figure it out as we go."
And at one time or another, then in those early days, I think all three of them were in helping you clean up the payables department and files and everything else.
Man. Yeah, the drawers when you originally at Barton. There's many stories around Barton, and everybody has tons of them. But we would open drawers and see just full of unopened mail, and we were all stressing out about what to get done with it. And we'd spend hours on the weekends just opening mail, looking at it, making sure it wasn't something we owed, or Back in the days, the stress. A little worried about those moments, but it all worked out.
So I want to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the most memorable stuff for me, which was raising capital, especially that first round, but even in the first few years. I think we kind of looked at all of it and looked at our business plan and our ideas and said, "Oh, well, this is obvious." And yet what I remember is talking to what seemed like hundreds of people, and most of which telling us no before we finally assembled even our really small group initially. What comes to mind thinking about some of those early investor conversations for you guys?
The one that will always come to mind for me, you guys did most of the investing work across the board. You have all the really great stories of this. But when you guys called me with Don Porch afterwards and were like, "Hey, great news, we got the money." And Steve just quietly said, "We also have a loan." I was like, "A loan? What loan?" And then he proceeded to tell us, which was a great call, that we needed to have our own money in the game, and since we had none, which made that transaction easy, he's like, "I'll loan you the money at this really great rate," and then he has skin in the game.
Yeah, that was actually, and now that I'm thinking back to that was even a year in when we were doing our second deal, and to your point, we'd invested what little we had to just get launched, and I remember talking to Don and that whole equity raise and him asking, "Well, are you guys investing in this next round?" And I remember having to tell him, and I was sitting actually, what's funny is, and I'll never forget this, I was sitting in the parking lot outside Chipotle, in between baseball games for a baseball tournament for one of the boys. And so Linda and the kids were all inside eating lunch, and Don called, and he asked me, "What are you guys investing in this round?" And I had to tell him, "Don, we put all our money into this the first round. We'd love to invest more, but we don't have any more." And his question was, "Well, what if I loan it to you? Will you invest it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." "Will you sign a personal guarantee?" "Absolutely."
Sure.
"Will your wife sign one too?" "I'm sure she'd be happy to." And then as a result, the four of us and Don, because if you guys remember, he said, "I'll invest as much as you'll borrow." And so I think between the four of us and him, we ended up being 25% of the raise in that round. And then to your point, we went deeply into debt to for the next several years, who I called Uncle Don.
I remember an investor, I think I remember who it was, but I won't say it anyway. But I remember one of the investors sitting around a table, and he made us go around the table and asked what our net worth was and what % we were investing. And it got to us and we're like, negative? Like, we're investing more than 100% of our net worth.
Yeah, we're all in.
Which he loved, and he became, actually, their family became our biggest investor in those early years. You know, I remember back to when we were trying to raise the money with Barton. And so, you know, first, David Alexander is the very first person that ever committed to us. And David, you guys know this, I mean, he was a mentor of mine for a long time. And he was the guy, actually, that a couple times before we actually did this, I'd call him up over the years and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, what do you think? And he always said, no, I don't think you're ready. I think you need to go get another job and get some more experience. And then when I called him late 2010, he's like, I think this is the one, you can count me in. And that was our first investor. And then, of course, you mentioned Don Porch. He was our first significant investor that really came in and committed. And then, of course, Paul, we talked about becoming the lead investor of all this. And then the dominoes all really started to fall. But Eric, you probably remember our trip through Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a part of that. I think that's where we met Don. But definitely some entertaining stories on that road trip.
Yeah, back then in those days, we did, every penny counted, right? So we did everything as cheap as possible. So we needed to raise, I think another $500,000 when we took that trip. And so we flew down to Texas. We knew Steve knew some investors and I knew some investors down there. And so we flew down there, and I stayed with my parents because it was free. And Steve stayed in one of the worst hotels I've ever seen. They had vending machine bagels in this hotel. He may still have the pen. So the first pitch, though, that we made was to a very big investor, and we thought we were nailing it. Actually, it was someone that we knew through my dad, and so he was there. And we thought we nailed it. And when we left, he was like, you guys have to ask for the money, you know. And we never made that mistake again. From there on out, we always asked for the sale.
But he didn't give us a second chance at it either.
He didn't. We didn't get it. It was right. When we walked out the door and we hadn't asked for it, he was gone for good.
Well, you know, we've talked a lot about some of those early investors, and certainly we talked about David and Don and Paul. Then there was Michael C., who got in pretty early in the mix as well. But, you know, one thing, what do you guys remember about really what our pitch was to them, and why? Like, you know, why did we think they should invest in this? What do you remember about some of their responses, and just what motivated them to actually support what was a really contrary and really kind of crazy idea at the time?
I mean, our pitch was that this is we are at the bottom of a cycle. We had many pages in our presentation about, you know, how much we had studied the housing market. But really, when it came down to it, I mean, you remember every single investor, they made a bet on us. It really was never, no one believed the housing, you know, the housing rebound like we did. But they did believe in us. And that was really the common denominator with everybody that was in early.
Yeah, I remember specifically when Don Porch called us and said he was in, his specific comment that I'll never forget was, you know what, I like you guys. I think you're going to do well. I want to put a little money in and see how you do. And if you do well, I'm going to be there to continue to invest. And I think you're right. I think the other thing that I remember, you know, if you think about it, I know we didn't say it this way. We had to dress up the pitch some. But you think about, you guys are probably in your late 20s, I was in my late 30s. We were finance guys. And we were good finance guys, and we were deal guys, but you know, we were really going to people and saying, hey, we got this great idea. We're gonna buy this company that's barely hanging on to solvency. We've never run anything except a finance group, but we're gonna buy that, and if you give us some money, we're gonna turn into a lot more. And that's a rough pitch. I know we cleaned it up a lot, but that was it at the core. And one of the things I think that really resonated, that you guys talked about it earlier, was that, number one, I mean, we were all in on this. We were committed, and we knew we had to make this successful because we all had families to take care of. And I think the second thing that really resonated with them was that the structure that we put together really did ultimately say that we're not going to make anything until we've made you a lot of money. And I think those things all coupled together, and them feeling like there was a lot of passion and motivation and some really good thought behind the thesis, I think is what all kind of came together and ultimately kind of pushed us over that finish line.
I think the real estate as part of that too helped us just a little bit. While we thought we were so much ahead on this housing cycle, and we were, I was much further behind than you two guys on the personal bet side. I didn't understand people were so focused on making a personal bet, which is crystal clear now and has been since. But when the real estate got introduced, and that was kind of a last minute change to the deal, that actually, I felt like that was kind of a turning point for the deal, because we were like, we got to buy the real estate, all a little worried about it. But that kind of gave you guys some extra leverage to pitch, which we didn't fully take advantage of at the time, but it did help everybody be like, we got real estate with this, we can deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's funny that the whole reason the real estate became part of the deal was really because we couldn't get a real estate investor to give us a decent deal for them to buy the real estate and us to lease it from them. And I remember talking to one of those firms and them making us a proposal, and it was horrible. I mean, it was just horrible. It was taken advantage of so badly. And we'd actually had our bankers tell us that they would finance the real estate. And I hadn't told this guy this yet. And so I went to him and I said, the proposal you're giving us, it's honestly so bad. I mean, you're really kind of telling us we should just buy the real estate and finance it ourselves. And he said, well, yeah, you absolutely should do that, but you can't. Which, never a good thing to tell us that we can't do it, right?
Don't say that.
And I said, well, what if I told you we could? And he said, well, then, yeah, I mean, if that was the case, then you should do it. And so we went back, right? And now the real estate became part of the deal. We had to raise a little bit more capital because of it. But I think you're right. It actually, in this weird way, it gave potential investors a little bit more comfort that there was a safety net under this thing. And hey, even if the business doesn't work out, we've still got this real estate that we can probably, liquidate and probably get out at least with most of our investment.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think just having a little bit of a safety net made a big difference. And it turned out to be a great investment.
Yeah.
It did. It turned out to be an amazing one. And then, what's crazy is, you think about it then from there, and each successive raise, obviously, it got a little easier, and the numbers got a little bit bigger. And here we are.
Yeah.
10 years in the making.
I do remember there was one other, and this is, I think this was back to right as we were kind of getting past that tipping point with the Barton financing. We talked earlier about our wives, and we'd done, I don't remember who it was, I think it was when Paul actually committed, which really kind of, that's when really kind of things started to come together. And we had just done, I think we'd just done some pitches to several investors. And honestly, I probably didn't tell you guys I was feeling this way, because I usually acted like I was totally sure everything was going to work out. But I had sent something out, and I'd messed up something in the pitch book in one of the pages. And I sent this thing out, and of course, after I sent it out, I caught this mistake. And I was just like inconsolable. Like I'm talking to Linda, and it's like 10 at night, and I'm going, I can't even get the numbers right in the book. Why is anyone going to invest in this? There's no way this is going to work. I mean, I was in total Eeyore mode, And it was so funny, because just like we were talking about earlier, in that support and commitment of them, she'd actually been sitting down the hall as I was doing all this stuff, and she was praying about all this stuff, and I walked in, and so I dump all this stuff, and she's like, I just have a lot of peace about this. This is going to work. It's all going to come together. I just know it is, And it was literally like, I think the next day, when it was either Paul or Don Porch, one of those guys made this big commitment, and it really was just kind of that nudge that got us over the line, and then it was really, we started getting traction, momentum, and everything came together.
I'll tell you, I've talked about this many times to people that I know, but it would have been very hard to do this. I don't know if any of us would have been successful on our own, because there were lots of days when Brian would be down and Steve and I would be optimistic and we would talk Brian off the cliff, or Steve and I would be pessimistic about raising the money and thinking we're not going to make it, and Brian would talk us off the cliff. It would have been very hard, I think, to have the conviction to stick with it without kind of the support of each other, because there were very few days when we all felt great early on.
And part of that too is we all felt a lot of personal responsibility for each other, so we were
Paul
always like,
probably
hey.
always felt great.
Yeah, Paul always did feel great. Paul supercharged us, by the way. I mean, he was kind of that kind of, we were kind of at that moment of what are we going to do? And then Paul kind of was like, hey, let's meet. And we were all so over prepared for that meeting. And it really was just a conversation. But we had like all these numbers and we were ready to go for everything he asked. And he just had a conversation with us. I mean, he knew us well, but that was a big kind of supercharged moment.
And ultimately, I think not only the five of us, and I agree with you, I mean, that was so important. Everyone played, I think, such an important part of the team, and it was all the puzzle pieces kind of coming together for the right group. But then even beyond that, I think when you think about our early investor group and our board for those first several years, in this very same way, how they played different roles of advisors and mentors, and some of them really challenging us at times, being optimistic, being patient. It really not only was our founding team just an incredible group, but really all those investors that we were able to pull together and bring into this. What an amazing team for those first several years.
Yeah, it was a special time for sure.
Well, we've been at this for a little while now, guys, and we got a lot of memories still to relive. So I don't know about you, but can I get you a drink?
I'll never turn a drink down.
Yeah, we don't turn drinks down.
Come on.
So, I guess what I think about now is kind of those first few years as we were working to turn Barton around and starting to put other deals together. And yet we were still kind of in very much startup mode. In fact, Eric, I'm thinking about your initial work on our logo. As we now, at our 10-year, we just redesigned the logo. But, you remember putting that together when you were tasked with that project early on?
Yeah, so the funniest part about that story, I don't know if you guys remember, but we had been talking about coming up with a name, and we had been talking about trademarks and copyrights, and I had looked at what it would cost to have somebody make us a logo, and I was just horrified. And I was like, I can do this. We'll watch a YouTube video real quick. We can figure this out. But because we've been talking about trademarks, one of my concerns was I just looked around on the internet for a picture of a bear, but I was like, this is probably a trademarked photo. We got to figure out some way around this. So I put it in Photoshop and then used a YouTube video to show me how to make it into a picture. I was like, well, now no one knows this. And then that's been the bear ever since. So people ask me for the vector image all the time. I'm like, yeah, there's no vector image.
Well, and it served its purpose for 10 years before we revised it and updated it. But
I refined it a couple times over the years, but you can only do so much when you start with an image on the internet and convert it into a picture.
And from that point on, you became the marketing expert for everything, no matter what. Business cards through any photo, website.
We used Wix to make the website because you could just click.
That's right, you designed our first website.
Yep.
Immediate hat of marketing.
What else? I mean, Brian, while we were doing marketing and fundraising, you were the one that was really so deep into the operations, particularly as we turned Barton around that first year. I know there was some hairy moments and some tough days. What do you remember about that first year as we were working on the turnaround?
So I think, probably one of the tougher stories is the end of the year. That's the one that we all probably remember the most about. We get this company going. We're all excited. I loved walking through the steel shop. That was I did that 5 times a day, every day. I loved that. It was such a cool experience. But running the finance, watching the finance side of that, man, when that contract, when we realized that we weren't going to make any money on that contract, I mean, not only did I throw up on the way home that night a couple times on the road, which is probably TMI, but anyway, that's kind of me. You know, trying to figure our way out of that, and kind of, I don't know, that happened on what, had to be about December 22nd, 23rd. It was right before Christmas, because I remember stressing out about this for Christmas. And then come back at the beginning of the year. We can skip the banking story there that was so traumatic, but I really remember that because that really, I think, defined every one of us a lot differently. And that big definition was, we have this huge problem and we have this issue that we are almost going to bankrupt our entire business. And instead of taking that as on the surface, we just said, let's figure out what we can do. And you know, the next 4 months in 2012, really those first 4 months of that year, I think were probably one of the best 4-month run we had. We were fully stressed out. We were trying to raise money. The bank said we needed $400,000, and I still remember it was the 3 of us actually sitting with the bank, and we said, we're not going to raise the money. This is in January. We will make it all back by June. And of course, they said no, and that was like the one thing when they said no, the 3 of us were like, we're going to prove them wrong, and we had made it all back by March. We still had the money coming in, and then they begged us to refinance with them, and we still left. But that was really kind of, I think about that story a lot, because that took so much grit and so much just passion from all of us to get through. It was really just kind of almost a cool moment. At the time, it didn't feel cool, but it's cool now to have that experience.
I remember at the time the fear that we all had going back to the investor group and asking for more money.
Yeah.
And I mean, no one wanted to do that. But I remember when we went back to them, I mean, it was not the difficult conversation that we all had anticipated. It was more to the tune of, you know, they saw the good things that we had already done in the business. And I remember when they gave us that money, and when we when we had the second investment come in with relative ease, I remember feeling then like, all right, well, these guys know, our investors, they know a good deal when they see it.
They're smarter than we are.
They feel good about this. So I felt immediately better about it.
Yeah.
But it was, I'll never forget that it was a much more pleasant conversation than I think any of us anticipated.
Yeah, I remember one of them saying, well, we really didn't think you'd raised enough in the first place. We figured you'd need to do that.
I remember that too.
And I was thinking, well, but you didn't give us more.
Yeah, I remember that too.
But, and you're right, Brian, I mean, that we had that big project that we got, and we thought that was like our home run. And then our home run ends up becoming like a big time strikeout.
Yeah.
And instead of making all this money that kind of gets us back on our footing, it actually set us back a ways with our whole turnaround plan, with what we told investors, with the bank, the whole bit. And that wasn't, I feel like that was the big challenge. And yet I also remember literally every Friday you called me with the little challenges.
I tried to avoid that part. Yeah, so, the Friday calls, Steve, I probably enjoyed those way less than anybody else. I never had good news on Fridays. Nothing was good on Fridays, and it seems like it always happened on Fridays, which then caused the weekends. We all had to work weekends because of it, and I guess that built more grit.
It did. It did. Although I stopped.
Except you didn't like talking to me on Fridays for a long time, and that still might be the case.
I stopped answering the phone after a while. I learned my lesson. But like you guys said, we got through that in those early months of 2012. We got our second deal and started working on diligence for that. That was where obviously Don challenged us to go into Hawk with him. But the other thing I remember at that time, you mentioned our bank, and I'll be kind and not mention their name, but you guys probably remember when we brought them in to talk about financing our second acquisition. And I think another one of those things that built that grit was having them sit in my office and tell us, we don't think we want to finance this because we don't think you've really done anything with Barton yet. And again, just like with the project and making back up for what we hadn't gotten done in the first 6 months, I remember us telling them, well, thanks for your opinion. We're doing this deal with or without you, and we'll figure it out. And then to your point, getting that one done and then going back and kindly showing them the door and going on with our new financing partners with Cole Taylor and with CIBC, and really starting to grow then out of that, with the Barton investment, with our second, and then those follow-on deals in the next few years, leading us up to 2014, where I think at that point we were probably 130 million in revenue, and then we really hit kind of this huge growth phase in 2014. We did several deals, tripled the size of the company. But kind of during all of that, I guess one thing I'd ask you guys is, I think that was a time when we were really kind of figuring out, well, how are we going to run this? What's our culture going to be like? What are the key things we're going to focus on? Who are we going to be as we build this company? And what do you guys remember about, kind of defining that during that time and figuring some of that stuff out?
I think, at least from, when we bought Golf and Basco, that was really when the questions all kind of had to crash down on us. We had two businesses that were not even aligned, not even in the same state, and we were trying to figure out, how we were going to combine everything. And I think the thing that I probably remember most about buying Golf and Basco, and it was probably honestly, I think it was probably the thing that carved out how we became Kodiak a little bit, was we were sitting at the Barton conference room when this happened, and we were just like, all right, we got these two separate businesses, we're banking them separate, we're doing all this separate stuff, and we kind of just had this group epiphany that, why are we so focused on one line? We wanted originally to be this investment company per se, but if we do it in building materials, why are we so focused on steel or lumber or windows or appliances? And I think that turning moment a little bit for me was like, man, we can do this across the building space. Nobody else is doing it. And we all kind of talked about it. And really the deal flow changed from that moment on once we did it.
I mean, if you think about it, our initial plan was to invest in multiple businesses across a spectrum of industries. So really to us, everyone else in the industry thought we were nuts. But to us, it was like, well, this is basically what we set out to do anyway from the start.
For us, it did help that we didn't know a whole lot about steel to begin with.
Right.
So if that's going well, why don't we invest in something else we don't know about?
I think the other thing that really stands out, when we were in the process of the Gulf and Basco deal, we had a potential investor who, I'll just say, was not a cultural fit for the way that we did business. And we ended up walking away from them at kind of the 11th hour. And honestly, our investor group was impressed that we had the guts and the conviction to walk away from them. And the seller was impressed that we had the guts and the conviction to walk away from them. And so we relatively easily raised the money that they were going to give us, and the seller gave us the time that we needed to raise it. But that was a pivotal moment for us too. I mean, that was, you think about the early days to, where we were barely raising money 18 months before, and now we're walking away from somebody wanting to give us money. I mean, that was a major turning point for us. And
I think that was made. I remember talking to Paul about that one and really deciding, are we going to, with some of the things that individual wanted to do in that deal, and how I think we felt like they were taking advantage of us, particularly taking advantage of the seller. And I remember talking to Paul about that one night, and one of us kind of just saying, or both of us really kind of agreeing that if we do this, it redefines who we are. Because right now we have a reputation of integrity and trust, and let's face it, if we go through with this, if we're gonna accept things like this, that's not who we are anymore, and that's not how we're gonna be viewed. And that's all we got at that point. That was really all we had to go on. It wasn't like we had this huge pool of capital. We would look people in the eye and tell them what we were gonna do with the deal and what we could do, and they trusted us. And I think that was a huge moment. And I think that really defined one aspect of our culture. I think the other thing you guys were talking about with the diversification, like to your point, we'd learned about this industry when we were at ProBuild. And we'd experienced the volatility that naturally comes with it.
Yeah.
In particular, when you're focused on one segment. And you know, in those early days, we'd talked about, well, how do we minimize that? Well, we minimize that with potentially being in different sectors of construction. We minimize it by being in markets and focusing on markets that really are going to grow over the long haul because they've just got good underlying trends of migration. You know, places like Texas and Florida and Colorado, which are, you know, still our three biggest states. Those were kind of some of those early strategic focus things. And then I think, you know, to you guys' point, we wanted to do this the way we wanted to do it, which was work with people we really respect, enjoy, and are close friends. We wanted to have integrity and be able to have people know that when we said something, we meant it, and we were going to follow through on it. And then I think really internally, as we started to grow and expand, and you know, Jones and New England Building Supply and others, that idea that we were going to be really just fiercely decentralized. We weren't going to try to sit here in Denver and tell everyone how to do everything. We were going to find great people, and we were going to partner with them, give them a lot of autonomy and support, and then work together as a team to get things done instead of the typical kind of corporate structure of command and control and push down all the answers from on high. What other things you guys think about kind of from a cultural standpoint, or why do you think, why did that matter, you know, as we looked at deals and as we built the organization in those early years?
Well, I mean, you know, future sellers don't know, you know, obviously don't know that story about us walking away. I mean, we told some people that story, you know, we used that as part of our sales pitch, but, you know, just that mentality, I mean, Kodiak has won a lot of processes with sellers because of that reputation, right? I think the other thing, you know, on the other side of the coin internally, I mean, Kodiak was a fun place to work, especially when we were getting going. I mean, it still is, but, you know, our employees all we had a good time there, you know, from the wing challenges to you know, the slam or the horse, the games of horse and the accounting wing, like, it was a fun place to work. And you see a lot more office spaces like that now, but back then, everywhere wasn't like that. And it was certainly a lot different than anywhere else in our building
space.
Product space.
Yeah.
We definitely never took ourselves too seriously.
No, that's for sure.
I think we all had enough weight on us from other things.
You know, it's funny, as you guys talked about kind of some of those cultural things with sellers in particular, it's funny because I hadn't thought about this. I literally just got back from a deal trip yesterday. And, you know, what's cool is back then, we were trying to convince people that, look, this is really who we are, and this is how we're going to operate. And, you know, even some of those early sellers would tell you now, at the time, I thought it'd be really cool if you were being really truthful, but I figured it was partly that, but it wasn't going to be all it was cracked up to be. And we really had to convince people, like, we're serious about this. This is how we want to run this business. This is how we want to build this business. And what's neat, you know, thinking about this trip I was just on, is all that work that was done in those early years as we were building this. Today, we don't have to convince people of that anymore. And when I was just with this seller that'll join us in a few months here, he knows our story. He's seen it play out and watched it play out for 10 years in the industry. And that reputation is so solidified, no one doubts it anymore. And then the other piece of that, I think, is what's cool and what was always kind of one of those kind of chip on my shoulder things that I wanted to prove was, if you guys remember, in the early days, we had a lot of people tell us, one, you guys are kind of crazy with the way you're trying to create this thing. But two, it may work when you're small, but once you get to a certain size, there's no way you can do that. And now, you know, we're sitting here. Back then we were doing it when we had, like you talked about, when we got our second company and we were going, well, how are we going to do this? Well, now we're sitting here with 31 companies and $2.3 billion in sales, and the culture hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And we've got this amazing team that we have a lot of fun together, and we work real hard, and we keep building a great business, just like what we kind of formed and started crafting, 10 years ago. So 2014, we tripled in size. For me, that really felt like when we that was really the first time I felt like, wow, like it's a real company now. We made it through the startup phase, and even to the extent that, let's face it, frankly, we moved into the first corporate office that we ever had that was really like felt like a real corporate office. Kind of for you guys, what was that year like of transition where we grew so much and we really kind of crossed over a threshold into kind of a new phase of the company?
It was exciting for sure. I mean, all of us had a lot of fun, picking out the office and picking out furniture and everything. Yeah, I know what you mean. It felt like a definite turning point. Just hanging the original, I don't know if they're still the same logos in the conference room, but hanging the logos on the wall was kind of a surreal moment.
Yeah, I mean, moving into the office and just opening the door kind of the first time, we talked about having a cool office. And at the time, we all watched Suits all the time, which was like the thing. And you got us all the Suits mugs and everything. But, just walking in and seeing the entire office and knowing that we had actually got to that point, it was pretty surreal. And then it took a few months to even understand you could actually move your own things into the office and they would stay. It was pretty awesome. So the other thing in 2014 that while moving into the offices was a big deal and getting everything was we did the consolidation of the banks. It's the first time we kind of looked at all of our businesses as one, and we kind of looked at ourselves both internally and we were telling the external world we were this one company and we were really just going after this whole segment for ourselves. That was another just big mark that while it wasn't in the office, it was just part of that whole cultural piece of it.
Definitely, it was a transformational time where we really did kind of grow up a little bit, I think. Yeah. And by the way, you talked about the logos. We definitely still have those. In fact, the whole wall's covered with every single operating company now. In addition to that, something you guys will remember are talking about coffees for closers back in the early days. We have an actual art print that says that on one of the walls as well. But then, what's interesting, I think, is at the same time we were going through that transformation with the company and really kind of growing up a little bit at that point. And at the same time, you guys will remember, we were all, the three of us and Kyle, were all kind of looking inward a little bit and saying, gosh, we frankly never thought this thing was going to get to this point. At that point, we were 450 million in sales, way beyond anything we'd ever really dreamed of this becoming. And we all went back and kind of quietly asked ourselves, well, what do we want to be when we grow up? Like, is this still where we should be and what we should be doing? Because what got us here was that we were so passionate about what we were doing. And I think we were all kind of asking ourselves some questions in that, as you look back on that, what did you guys realize during that kind of time of us kind of questioning what does the future look like for us individually?
In 2014, we were riding pretty high. We had this office. We were doing a lot of good things. We're consolidating. But, nobody really saw coming out of 13 where we were at, behind closed doors, all the struggles. And we're really trying to figure out what steps we had to take and really how to transform ourselves. And, I don't really remember all the feelings in 14 except feeling great because it was kind of the first year that we had a stamp and a rubber approval just on kind of going around everything. But, I think at that point, most of us felt very confident that, hey, we have something that we can continue with here for really a long time. And we kind of have unraveled what we think our strategy is. We don't really care what the industry's saying about you have to be lumber or steel. Everybody was still kind of on that path. And we really felt that we were carving ourselves a new path. And I think that kind of gave us extra motivation. Back to your point about don't ever tell us no. I think we really felt like at that moment we really did have something special, and we knew we did. And we had all the right people. I mean, all the acquisitions we'd done up to that point, we really got a lot of great people in the door. We had built this great corporate office. Our personnel for once felt like, I mean, we almost felt invincible in 14. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we were starting to get a little more national recognition at that point. But I do think, you know, that was certainly, it was getting to be, you know, when we started out, it was small and we could kind of do everything our way. And even though we maintained, you know, the cultural things that we wanted in Kodiak, you know, there's some things that as you get bigger, as you know, at that point, I think we probably had over 1,000 employees, or we were approaching that. There are certain things that you just have to do a little bit differently. So, I mean, I do think while we were all on, it was an exciting time for all of us. All of us were looking internally a little bit and thinking about, you know, what the next phases of our lives were going to be. I had my daughter at the time, my first daughter at the time, and, you know, that changes people's perspectives on lives and everything too. And so it was a great year, though. It was a huge turning point for the company.
So, you know, you guys are right. I mean, when we were going through that, we were having a lot of success during that time, growing a ton. But candidly, I mean, it was also tough. We were transitioning because we couldn't necessarily keep running things exactly the way we kind of had in startup mode. And we were trying to wrestle with that, figure that out. Alongside with that, we were all kind of taking that step back and saying, this thing's been really successful, but is this what we want to keep doing? And we each asked ourselves that question. And I know for me, it kind of was, frankly, kind of surprising. I'd never envisioned wanting to do what I do today, but it was during that time kind of taking that kind of step back and kind of thinking through it and realizing, wow, I'm in my dream job. And then at the same time, you guys were thinking through that, Kyle was thinking through that. We all came up with different answers of really, where do we want to go from here? And even though you guys aren't at Kodiak anymore, you're still investors in Kodiak. And you've also you answered that question for yourselves. And I'd love for you guys to just talk a little bit about kind of what you realized in that in terms of what you wanted to do. And you know, talk a little bit about what you guys are doing now, because even though it's not part of Kodiak, it's definitely part of the Kodiak story. And I'd just love to have you guys kind of talk a little bit about those things.
Yeah, for me personally, the experience at Kodiak, you know, I felt like at that time I had learned a lot about raising money, and it had always been a dream of my dad and I to get together to try to put together an investment in the waste industry. I'd grown up around that, and I felt like my experience there gave me a lot of the tools to know how to raise the money, how to structure deals, how to find acquisitions. Really, my dad, who had spent his entire career on the corporate side of the world and never had to deal with, we joke now, we always say, you know, we make sure that we don't run out of money. He had never had to deal with that side of the world. And I felt like, I don't know if I was all the way there in 14, but I was starting to think about that, at least in the back of my mind, that maybe that was something that I wanted to do with the experience that we had gained at Kodiak. And you're absolutely right that, you know, you look at now, what we're doing now is in so many ways related to Kodiak. I mean, it's the same bank. It's many of the same investors. You know, we were able to raise the money to do this in about 5 minutes because of our success at Kodiak. So it really is. There's so much crossover, and I think about that all the time.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, it's for you guys both know this, you know me well enough. My happy spot was walking around companies. I love talking to people, which is not really normal when you meet me. You don't think I like that stuff. One-on-one, I like it. Big
You
groups.
like it a lot more than Kyle does.
Yeah, well, yeah, fair. Big groups, not my thing, but yeah, so, you know, I loved that part, and, you know, I had been talking to Eric, and, you know, Eric and I have we all had a great working relationship. Eric and I have been real close, even back from ProBuild days, and when he was talking about him and his dad doing that, we started talking about, you know, kind of taking that forward and looking at something more along that smaller, back to the original kind of Kodiak era, you know, doing something a little bit smaller. I can be kind of myself and do that smaller business thing and meet the people and kind of know everybody's name, which to me is a big deal. So, you know, Kodiak was amazing. I mean, the beginning part of that, I knew everybody. I went to every yard. I did every inventory. No matter what it was, I was there willing to kind of go into it. And as it grew, I realized, looking at it, I couldn't be at every yard for every one of those turns. And I think that was, to your, you know, you said you thought it was interesting that you were in your spot. I found it interesting because if you would have asked me 3 years prior to that, I would have had a totally different answer. Yeah. And that the Kodiak experience literally made sure, it kind of made me realize exactly who I am, yeah. Which I appreciate that for. So.
And you know, it's funny, most people don't know this, but as we were talking to you, and you were giving us a lot of valuable guidance on what we were going to try to do next. But as we were talking to you and working with my dad to try to start to find some garbage companies, that's right at the time that the Court Square transaction came up. And so Brian and I agreed to stick around and help make sure that got done. And so a year later, it took us a long time to get it done. And a year later, maybe not quite a year, but it felt that long, my dad, who's our third partner, was sitting there saying, you know, are you guys ever coming over? Or like, am I just going to do this by myself for the rest of the time? But it's funny because we always talked about, you know, like we wanted to go back to doing something small, and ultimately now, I've just had an investor push me on this just the other day. He's like, you know, you guys are already $10 or $15 million bigger than you said you were going to be. How much further are you guys going to take this? And so it is funny how you end back kind of in the same place. Yeah. So it's exciting, and think about Kodiak often and all the valuable things that we learned there.
Well, I'll tell you, it's exciting. You guys know, I mean, you know, getting to be an investor in what you're doing now, in just even a small way, is so cool to see. I mean, gosh, we've been, you know, we started working together, Eric, in 2007. Brian, geez, we were together since most of the time since like 2003, 2004, yep. In different companies before we did all of this. And I mean, I love driving around town, especially in the mornings, and seeing a Barton truck or a Jones truck or Direct or Specialty Appliance. But a real close second is seeing one of your garbage trucks go around town. And when I go to the airport, geez, I don't know, you guys like have cornered the market on
the
E470. You own the tollway. I see, like, if you just based on that, I would think you were like the largest company in the industry. But the pride I feel, seeing what you guys have done with that, seeing your trucks around town and knowing, you know, the business you're building now, has honestly been really gratifying for me. That's awesome. Well, you know, I mean, we've run the gamut of all this, but I kind of take it back as we wrap up, kind of take it back to the beginning. When we started this, right, we were 20 million in sales, 80 employees, no profitability. And I remember early on us talking about, wow, you know, what if this was actually successful? You know, someday maybe we could be like 250 million in sales. Like Kodiak maybe could get to that. Wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be incredible? And instead, here we're sitting here now, in one of our, you know, more recent expansion facilities for Jones and Barton here in Denver, and we didn't get to 250 million. We got to 2.3 billion and counting, as we add to that, and then in the midst of that, you guys spin off and start a new business, and you're growing a business and creating jobs and creating value for investors, and just, I don't know how you say it other than that we've been incredibly blessed to have an incredible journey together, and you know, I hope you guys, even though you're not on a day-to-day basis part of Kodiak today, because you're off doing all these other great things, to be able to take a step back like we've done today and kind of just relive some of those memories and remind ourselves of how gritty, we've used that word several times, how challenging those times were, but what's come out of that, what we built together, and you know, you guys are now, you're the founders of a company that it's made the Inc. 5000 list the last 4 years in a row, has been one of the largest companies literally in this industry today, as really as you guys talked about we've kind of introduced a new model to our industry, which is one that's much more diversified, and all these things that a lot of people said, well, you can't really do it this way. Well, we kind of figured out together with a lot of hard work and a lot of luck, a lot of support from some great people and wives and everything else to really create something special. Well, guys, I want to thank you for taking some time to get together today. It's been a blast to just kind of relive some of the memories of the early days especially. And then honestly, more than that, I want to thank you for having the confidence and the trust for what we all launched together. You probably don't realize how much your fingerprints are just all over what Kodiak is today. And so thank you for that, and congratulations on what you're doing now. And thanks for getting together today just to relive all this a little bit.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for having us, and mostly thank you to you and everybody else at the team there for proving our thesis right about the diversified, the diversified strategy. Brian and I love seeing that, and feel like we're spiking the football every single day when we see it in the news.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody.
Well, cheers, guys.